Mary.
Matt, there's been reporting in Israeli media about how the attack has taken place. Basically, it said the drone fired 3 missiles in succession, and like each of them sort of struck one of the cars. And Reuters just, we have an interview with Jose Andres actually just on our wire, and he told us that the Israeli army targeted the convoy, quote, systematically, car by car. And you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about this being a mistake and unintentional. How do you reconcile those two, the reporting and what Jose Andres is saying and what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying?
So 2 things about that. So number one, the chief of staff for the Israeli Defense Forces has come out and said it was a misidentification. So while they were I took that to mean while they were targeting those cars, they did not believe that it was the World Central Kitchen that was operating those vehicles at the time. But that said, we need to wait and see the outcome of this investigation to know with any confidence what it was that happened, and we're going to wait to do that. But the second point is, it doesn't really matter how they made the mistake. At the end of the day, you have 7 dead aid workers who were there trying to deliver humanitarian assistance. So whatever the reason was that led to this tragedy, whatever the mistake that happened inside the IDF, it's unacceptable. And they need to do better, and they need to put measures in place to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
And given there was an American citizen killed in this attack, why isn't the United States conducting its own investigation?
So we don't conduct investigations of the type I believe you're referring to from this building, so I wouldn't presume to speak to any.
But, I mean, could the administration consider sort of Department of Justice can do that, FBI can do that?
Again, we don't conduct that type of investigation from the State Department. I'm not going to speak on behalf of any other agency.
And I just want to ask the evergreen question. We've reported, and other media outlets have reported as well, that that the administration is looking at furthering a big $18 billion aircraft package, weapons package to Israel. We reported that earlier this week. And looking at President Biden's statement last night, saying like this is not a one-off, and you've just talked about the number of humanitarian workers who've been killed. There are a lot of journalists who've been killed. Doesn't this kind of, like, given the accusations of disregard for non-combatants by the IDF, doesn't this kind of incident make U.S. stop and reconsider its arms sales or military aid to Israel?
So let me say 2 things with respect to that question. Number one, with respect to some of the reporting that we've seen over the past few weeks about arms transfers or potential arms transfers to Israel, some of which we have not officially notified to Congress and have not moved forward on at all. But a lot of those are with respect to weapon systems that would not be delivered for years. Long after, hopefully, the conflict in Gaza has been resolved. It's something.
But I'm not entirely.
I just want to say, I think it's important to because it does go to the exact point. We have had a long-standing security relationship with the state of Israel that predates this administration, that predates the current government in Israel, and that has existed through Democratic and Republican administrations in Washington and through governments of different parties in Israel, because we are committed to Israel's long-term security. So when I get questions, and I see some of the reporting about arms transfers or potential arms transfers to Israel, some of which started years ago or approved years ago, and some of which relate to systems that won't be delivered until years down the road. I think it's important to put in context that those relate to our overall security relationship with Israel and our overall commitment to Israel's defense against a number of adversaries that it faces in the region that are committed to the destruction of Israel. Now, with respect to the question I know that you're getting at, which we've addressed a number of times here, we continue to be committed to Israel's defense, but we continue to press them consistently to ensure that they fully comply with international humanitarian law, and critically, that when they do make mistakes, as they very obviously did yesterday, that they are transparent about those mistakes, that they investigate them, and if appropriate, there's accountability.
I'm not entirely sure how the delivery date for this being down the line 4 years, 5 years has an impact on your decision making today, because you're making the decision today with the information that you know there are like various accusations about Israeli military's conduct in Gaza. Elsewhere, there are incidents that the State Department is looking at whether Israel has breached international rules like humanitarian law. So I'm not entirely sure how relevant it is that the delivery of those are like down the line. But just one last thing. You said a minute ago, so you talked about misidentification. Are you referring to the video of Israel Chief of Staff, or are you?
Correct.
I mean,
Yeah, correct.
And
The
also,
statement he said publicly.
Is that what U.S. government have been told, that it was a misidentification?
They have told us. They have told us the same things privately that they have said publicly.
But I mean that they took the strike, but they weren't aware that it was a WCK convoy.
I am not going to. They have. As I said, the thing that the point about misidentification that General Halevi said in that public statement is what they have communicated to us privately. I'm not going to get further into the conversations, but ultimately, what's important is that they conduct an investigation to identify how that mistake happened, exactly how it happened, and what they can do to prevent it from happening in the future.
So has the government of Israel shared with you any information that prove that this was what they're saying a misidentification, or are you just trusting that?
What we are trusting is that they're going to conduct a full investigation. But that said, we will look at how that investigation is conducted, we will look at the results of that, and then we will pass judgment on it. So I don't want to pass judgment on anything that they have said privately or publicly until they've conducted a full investigation. And I only say that because, as is true with our own military, as is true with militaries around the world, oftentimes the early events of what happened don't bear out when you conduct a full investigation into the underlying facts. So we're going to wait and pass judgment when we see the full results.
But in a way, you're passing judgment by standing up there and saying it was a misidentification already before you have the actual facts before you.
I don't have any reason to dispute that, but we will wait and see the full investigation. Go ahead.
Gumara asked, but when you're talking about 3 strikes on this convoy, I mean, even if we take at face value that there's misidentification, I mean, is that appropriate? I mean, you have a convoy which is apparently clearly marked by aid, but if it's whoever it was in there, having 3 strikes to systematically destroying it, do you think that's an appropriate way to go?
It's hard to comment on that without getting into a hypothetical. You can obviously see a scenario if there were a convoy of clear terrorists that it might be appropriate. That obviously was not the case here. So I think we will wait, as I said, for the results of the investigation to pass judgment on how this mistake happened. But as I said, it ultimately doesn't matter whether it was 3 or 2. They killed 7 aid workers. However they made the mistake, it resulted in a tragedy that should have never happened, and that's what they need to prevent from happening again.
So you said that we have 7 dead international aid workers, and you want to avoid seeing more killing in the future. So therefore, you said that you asked Israel to coordinate better and to establish deconflicting zones. But this is contradict with what exactly happened with World Central Kitchen. They coordinated with the Israelis to every detail, and they went into exactly the deconflicting zone on the beach, and yet they were targeted. So how this applies now? What difference does it make?
That is exactly the point I was making. They've had deconfliction measures. They have had coordination measures to try to prevent tragedies like this from happening, and they haven't worked well enough. Clearly, they haven't worked well enough. When you see not just these 7 aid workers that have been killed, but over 200 aid workers that have been killed since the outset of this conflict. And so they need to do a better job. Some of this has been bureaucratic, with aid workers not talking to the with the IDF not having set up the right channels to communicate with aid workers, and messages not getting passed back and forth. But as I said, ultimately, whatever the details are that broke down here, the result is unacceptable, and that's why they need to do better. And so that's why they need to have improved deconfliction and coordination measures to prevent tragedies like this from happening in the future.
Okay, so as a result of the killing of the World Central Kitchen staff, also ANIRA, which is an American NGO, suspended their work in delivering aid to Gaza. And before that, UNRWA was targeted by the Israelis of saying there are some people who were involved in the October 7 attack, and we're still waiting for the investigation. So practically 3 of the vital organizations that providing aid to Gaza either suspended their work or they don't have enough fund to help the people who are starving in Gaza. Some people believe that this actually is a kind of a strategy on behalf of the Israelis to use food as a weapon of war and to prevent Gazans of receiving the aid and therefore forcing them to leave as some kind of strategy by Prime Minister Netanyahu? Do you see it? Can you entertain this for a second, this thought that actually this is not a mistake or unintentional or haphazard or what accident, but actually there is some kind of thought process that get into it by the Israelis?
So a few things just in the preface to the question first. So with respect to UNRWA, it's not just the Israeli government that found that there were UNRWA workers that participated in the terrorist attacks. It was UNRWA itself. And I think that's always an important thing to remember. UNRWA itself that actually briefed the United States on its own findings. With respect to UNRWA, it does continue to operate. Obviously, it's faced funding challenges, but you've seen a number of countries who have resumed their funding, and UNRWA is continuing to do important work on the ground now, vital work that we want to see continued. So while they have faced funding challenges, they are continuing to deliver humanitarian assistance inside Gaza, and it's critical that that work continue. Obviously, there are organizations that are going to look at what happened the other day now and be worried about the safety and security of their employees. How could they not be? And so it is why it is incumbent on the government of Israel to institute better measures to give confidence to aid workers that their employee, or to give aid organizations that their employees won't be killed just trying to deliver humanitarian assistance. With respect to the overall policy, look, I can just speak to what the government of Israel has said and what they have done. So they have said they want to see humanitarian assistance come in, and they have allowed humanitarian assistance to come in through Rafah, through Kerem Shalom, through the 96 Gate. They're working with us on this maritime option that we are standing up with the cooperation of other countries in the region. But in all of these circumstances, it has been not enough. It has been too little. It has been plagued in many cases by bureaucratic delays and bureaucratic obstacles that we are continuing to try to work through. But it's kind of the same thing as with respect to it's the same point I'm making with respect to these deaths. Whatever the reason, the amount of humanitarian assistance hasn't gotten in at the levels it should have, the ultimate fact is the fact, which is not enough food, not enough water is getting in right now, and the government of Israel needs to do more to allow it to get in.
President Biden yesterday expressed outrage over the killing of 7 aid workers from the World's Central Kitchen in Gaza. Is the administration also outraged by the killing of, nearly 200 aid workers, 100 journalists, 33,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children? Are you outraged by this too?
We are outraged by every loss of civilian life in Gaza. And you've heard the president speak to this. You've heard the secretary speak to this in saying far too many civilians have been killed. Too many aid workers have died in this conflict. Too many journalists have died in this conflict. And we want to see Israel do a better job in minimizing all of those casualties.
Just one more on that. Biden also in the same statement said that Israel has not done enough to protect aid workers and civilians, and you yourself said that you have repeatedly urged Israel to take some steps to minimize civilian harm in Gaza. And if there are steps that Israel needs to take and Israel chooses not to take them, doesn't it mean that Israel is deliberately attacking aid workers and civilians?
No, I don't think you can necessarily make that conclusion because because sometimes there are bureaucratic obstacles that are presented, and we try to work through those bureaucratic
How
obstacles.
do you explain the killing of 33,000 Palestinians then?
So partly this is because Israel is operating in an incredibly difficult environment where Hamas hides behind human shields. They're operating in an urban environment where Hamas has constructed tunnels beneath apartment buildings, hides in mosques, hides in hospitals, even hospitals that like Al-Shifa that Israel had cleared. Hamas returns to those hospitals. And so it is an incredibly difficult environment, and the Israeli Defense Forces face real challenges.
Does this justify
real challenges, but I'll say it does not minimize at all their responsibility to do everything possible to prevent taking civilian life. Tom.
Just to follow up on the several questions about the value of investigations after actions by the IDF. I mean, you've called numerous times for investigations after Palestinians have been killed in recent years. Some of those have been US citizens. In the last 2 years, Omar Assad, February 2022, found dead after being detained by Israeli soldiers. You called for a thorough criminal investigation and full accountability. Shireen Abu Akleh, as we know, May 2022, a US citizen. You called for a full investigation. June 2023, Omar Katin, a US resident in Tura which is a town full of US passport holders in the West Bank. You called for full accountability and justice. I haven't, what are you satisfied with the outcome of those 3 investigations for a start? And then what should we read into your call for an investigation in this case?
So I can't speak to the specifics of every one of those investigations. Some of them predate
Some of them are very high profile.
I say some of them predate my time here. Before I was working at the State Department, I can say with respect to the investigation of Shireen Abu Akleh, of course, we called on Israel to investigate, and we also called on them to cooperate with our investigation. And they did cooperate with our investigation that the U.S. Security Coordinator conducted that concluded that gunfire from IDF positions was likely responsible for her tragic death. And so there were steps that they took to cooperate with the investigation that we had. Ultimately, as it pertains to the deaths of, and I should say there are 2 other cases that are ongoing right now. One of American citizens who were killed in the West Bank. One investigation that's being conducted by Israeli law enforcement. One that's being conducted by Palestinian Authority law enforcement. And in all of those cases, we want the same thing. We want a full investigation. We want it to happen as quickly as possible, but we don't want that swiftness to come at the expense of thoroughness. Ultimately, it's important that they get it right. And then with respect to all of them, we will make judgments on a case-by-case basis on whether that investigation was conducted fully and appropriately and led to appropriate outcomes and results.